Hello everyone, my name's Marcy. I am the mom of 4 kids. My youngest of whom is Freya, and she has a rare syndrome called Cornelia de Lange syndrome. It affects mostly growth and development. In her, it also comes with a limb difference and reflux and feeding difficulties, seizures, a lot of different things, but today we're focusing on the feeding difficulties because it is Feeding Tube Awareness Month. And a lot of people don't know that Freya did have a feeding tube the first couple months of her life. And I just wanted to share that story with you guys. So Freya was born early. She was 35 weeks and 6 days, so almost 36 weeks. This was amazing though. We were told originally that she probably would be born anywhere between 27 weeks to 32 weeks because of a lot of problems she was having with pressure in her umbilical cord. We made it to almost 36 weeks, which was just, no one thought we would get that far. And when she came out, immediately went to the NICU. We knew she was very, very, very small. She also had a limb difference that we knew about. So the plan was to immediately take her to the NICU just to check everything out, make sure everything was okay. At this point, we did not know it was Cornelia de Lange syndrome. We just knew she had a limb difference, she was very small, and likely had some sort of genetic syndrome, but we didn't know what it was. So they took her to the NICU, checked her out, and everything checked out okay. She was breathing on her own, blood sugar was good, everything was okay. So they brought her up to me, and that was really surprising because the plan was she would be in the NICU. There was never talk of she'll come up to be with you. And so that was amazing. I had her at 2. She came up to me, I believe, about 5 o'clock. And I got to cuddle her and dress her in clothes and try to feed her. But very quickly it became apparent that she was not eating enough. We tried breastfeeding, that didn't work, so we tried bottle feeding, and she was only taking just like tiny little sips. And because she was early and so small, they needed to check her blood sugars to make sure that she was getting enough to eat, basically, and her body was doing the right things with that food. And her blood sugars were very low all throughout the night. They were borderline. We would have like an okay one and then a low one, and then an okay one and then a low one. And then it just got to a point where it was low, 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 low. And so the NICU came back and got her, I believe it was about 4 or 5 in the morning. So we spent about 12 hours together. They came and took her, and I had been awake all night trying to feed her, doing blood sugars, and the nurse practitioner was like, we're going to take her, we're going to put a feeding tube in her, we're going to get her sugars up, I'm going to start a IV line so that we can give her any medication she needs. And I was like, take her, cool. So they took her. I slept for 2 hours and woke up and immediately wanted to go see Freya, of course. So my best friend Jessica was there with me. She was with me until like 1 in the morning, and then she showed up at like 6:30 or 7 with some chai tea, which is both of our favorites, and some gluten-free pastries, and was like, let's go see your baby. She's amazing. So we walked downstairs, and my husband was home with my older 3 kids before anybody comes after him in the comments. Someone had to be with my older 3 kids, and he was home with them. So we walked down, and this was the first time I saw her with her feeding tube. I worked at the hospital on the postpartum floor, but I sometimes would help in the NICU and also in pediatrics. So seeing a baby with an NG feeding tube was not anything shocking to me. The NG feeding tube goes through the nose, back, down the throat, into the stomach. So this was how she was getting her food. They were just pumping her food in to her stomach through that tube. The plan was that we could get her eating soon and she could go home without that tube. Within a couple days, it became very apparent to me that that was not going to happen. So I started asking the doctor, like, when would you allow me to go home with a feeding tube? And at this point, they did say that they were suspecting that it was Cornelia de Lange syndrome. And I had Googled and all the things, and I just said, most of these kids have a feeding tube. Why am I sitting in the hospital when all she's needing is feeding? I can do this at home. I know I can. And the first doctor said she has to be 40 weeks gestation. So I would have to be there, or no, 42 weeks gestation. So I would have to be there in the NICU with her for another 6 weeks. And that was so crushing because all I was doing was feeding her. She wasn't needing any other help. And so I was like, okay, so I just planned to be there because I was pumping and feeding, and I felt very strongly that I needed to be there to learn how to do the feeding tube and to show them that I could do this at home. I was convinced I would convince them that I could go home early because I was there every feeding this child. So eventually the doctors switched in the NICU. And so when the new doctor came on, I was like, when could we go home with a feeding tube? That's the only reason she's here. She's not needing any other help. I know I can do this at home. Any other kid with CDLS has a feeding tube. When can I go home? And the doctor looked at me and was like, you can do that. Yeah, that sounds good. He's like, let's keep you here. He was working for 5 days. That was his shift. And he said, on my 5th day, I will send you home. Let's train you on how to do the feeding tube. There were other things that my husband had to watch a CPR video. I was CPR certified because I worked at the hospital, but there were certain things that you have to do, and he had to prove that he knew how to do the feeding tube, and I did as well, before we could go home. So he's like, at the end of my 5 days, we'll send you home. And I was ecstatic because we had been there at this point for just over a week, and I really was missing my older kids. I just wanted to be home. I was so exhausted. So I was very excited that he was willing to send me home and be able to do the feeding tube at home. So the nurses trained me on how to insert the feeding tube. With the NG tube, it's important because as you're putting it down the throat, there's basically 2 ways it can go. It can go into the lungs or into the stomach. Obviously, we don't want it to go into the lungs. So they had to teach me how to put it in, get it down to her stomach, test to make sure that it actually was in her stomach and not in her lungs, and how to run the pump. While I was there those last 5 days, the doctor, because I lived in a different city, our NICU was about an hour away from our house, but the elevation change between the two is something like 3,000 feet. It's really a drastic difference. And so he was worried that because she was going up in elevation so much that she might struggle to breathe in the higher elevation. So we started oxygen down in the NICU, even though she didn't need it down there, just in preparation for bringing her home, so that I was trained on the oxygen, even though that was a part of my job duties anyway. So that was a quick training. But I had never placed an NG tube, so that was important to learn. Also learning how the pump that we used at the hospital to pump the food in her stomach was not the same pump that they sent us home with. So I had to learn how to work the new pump, and get all that. And I was so ready to come home. And in my mind, I really thought, because she was eating probably about half of her feeds with a bottle, I really thought we would come home and just be a couple days and be off the feeding tube. That's what, in my mind, I thought. A common misconception is that people, when they are on a feeding tube, don't eat by mouth at all. And that's just not true. A lot of people will do a mixture of both. I know a couple different kids with CDLS that can do thickened food and eat a thickened food, but can't handle like thin liquids at all. So water, juice, medicine that's really thin, anything like that. So they'll use their feeding tube for that, and along with a little bit of formula just for a little extra added nutrition. And that's what we were doing with Freya at home. She was bottle feeding, like I said, about half the time, and then we would feed her with the pump anytime that she couldn't eat. She was so tired her first 3 months of life. So she just did not have the strength to eat. The coordination was there because she could do it about half the time, but she just was so tired. When we went home with the feeding tube, they did have a home health nurse come and weigh Freya once a week, and they also were on call if ever we couldn't place the feeding tube back in, or if we wanted them to come place the feeding tube. They were on call for that. We also had a feeding therapist come to the house to help us with the bottle feeding and help us hopefully get her off that feeding tube. Freya was on the feeding tube, I think about 2 months after we got home. Looking back at her newborn life, all I remember is pumping and feeding and pumping and feeding and pumping and feeding. She did not handle formula well, and so I was pumping so she could have my breast milk. She had severe reflux when she was a baby. Severe. We had to prop her, we had to put like books under her mattress, her crib mattress, so it was slanted. But then we also had to have like a boppy pillow around the bottom so she wouldn't slide down, because anytime she was flat, she would puke. Anytime. And we talked to her doctor about this because she was on an oxygen monitor that would beep if her oxygen got low. We talked to him about, putting the boppy there, because they teach you nothing in the crib with the baby. But when the risk of throwing up and aspirating that reflux is so high, they're okay with propping up the mattress and putting something to hold her in place. So that was all approved. The feeding tube, at the time, I just wanted to get rid of it. I was ready to get rid of it. Anytime one of her doctors mentioned a G tube, I was a flat out like, no, she doesn't need that. In the meantime, after we came home from the hospital, Freya had 2 negative tests for CDLS. So at the time, I was even questioning, like, is it Cornelia de Lange syndrome? Is it anything? We had done so many tests. I'm pretty sure I have a video on this if you want to go. I think it's called Our Diagnosis Journey. But I just was questioning everything. I was like, maybe she doesn't even have a genetic syndrome, because all these tests are coming back negative. We tested for, I think, 10 separate syndromes. We looked at all her chromosomes. We did that CDLS test twice, and everything came back negative. So at that point, when they suggested doing the long-term G-tube, which is where they put a tube straight into her stomach here, I was like, No, she doesn't need it. She's eating okay on her own. She ended up pulling her own feeding tube out at 2 months. So she was almost 3 months old, which is typical. Kids do that all the time. It's just here and it's taped in, but babies, if they have their hands on their face, will yank it out all the time. And at that point, I talked to my doctor and I was like, I just want to do a week. Give me a week. Let me see what we can do with her weight, because the nurse was coming every week to check her weight. So that week he came and checked and she had gained 1 ounce, which was not a lot, but it was enough that I could show that she could gain weight on her own without the feeding tube. And so the doctor agreed to try without the feeding tube longer. And she kept gaining weight very, very slowly, but steadily. And so since then, there have been a couple close calls. One where her doctor really wanted us to do the feeding tube again at night to help her gain weight, which we didn't do. He was really nervous. Kids with CDLS are very small and grow very slowly. She was doing okay on her CDLS chart, but just okay, like not great. But I felt with that chart, our kids, so CDLS kids have their own growth chart that's separate and different from a typical kid's growth chart. So I felt like she was doing good enough on that we wouldn't do that again. There was another time when Freya was she was almost 3. She was 2, but she was a couple months from being 3, that her reflux got really, really bad again. And I went to the GI doctor and told him, we need a feeding tube. She had lost about 1 pound of weight. She wasn't eating. It was awful. And I said, I think we need a feeding tube. And he, bless him, was like, I will do that if that's what you want. But I do have a couple things we could try before we get to the feeding tube. And I am so grateful for him, because I was just defeated and he could see that. And he was like, if you want, we can, but we can try this other stuff. So we did try. It was medication and a complete elimination diet. We changed her formula. We took out every allergen that could possibly be causing this added reflux, and it worked. So that's actually when we switched to Kate Farms formula, which I absolutely love. I love Kate Farms, their company. It was started by a family who wanted to create a food for their tube-fed daughter. And Freya has done so well. She's gained weight. She loves it. She's so excited every time we get out a bottle for her. So I just can't say enough good things about Kate Farms. And while I look back now, I love that feeding tube. It gave us the opportunity to feed her. And if we didn't have it, I really don't know what would have happened. I don't know if she would have survived without the feeding tube. And it gave us a chance to bring her home and be at home with our family, which I desperately wanted. And I now look to the future, and if Freya does ever need a feeding tube, I honestly am totally open to it. Even when she's sick, I think, man, it'd be so nice if she had a feeding tube right now. We could just pop medicine in her. We could feed her through the feeding tube and she wouldn't have to struggle to breathe and swallow. So there are definitely some positives to having a feeding tube. And I think there's probably a chance that one day she will need one. And I'm just grateful that that's an opportunity we have, that we could have that surgery and give Freya what she needs, just a different way than eating by mouth. Currently, Freya relies mostly on her Kate Farms formula. and only has bites of food here and there throughout the day. She's not to the point where she can eat food and rely on that for her nutrition. We need to supplement with that formula all the time. So we'll see. There could be a point where her reflux could get a lot worse. It's a common thing with Cornelia de Lange syndrome to have severe reflux, and that can cause damage to the throat. And at that point, we might have to do a feeding tube. And I'm okay with it. I feel like I have grown so much just through seeing people with feeding tubes in the CDLS community especially, and how they're thriving with that feeding tube has totally changed my mind on Freya having one in the future. So I'm grateful to those families that share their feeding tube journey and help me understand what a life-saving, life-giving device it can be. Happy Feeding Tube Awareness Week, and I hope you enjoyed our feeding tube story with Freya, and I hope it has opened your mind to feeding tubes and what they do and how they help people. And I hope that so many people are sharing their stories this week just to kind of bring awareness to feeding tubes and to show how amazing they are. I hope you guys will come back next time. I'm not exactly sure what we'll be doing. I'm hoping to do something fun this weekend with the family. So come back and see what we're up to this weekend.